step into the realm of daring ideas and transformative dialogues. This is Voices from the Edge, the podcast that pushes boundaries and ventures beyond the ordinary. Here, we confront the crucial issues that shape our world today. From the heartbeat of community challenges to the untold chronicles of leadership. From the relentless pursuit of social justice to the essential lessons in safety and lifelong learning. Voices from the Edge takes you to the crossroads of change. Because the edge is not just a boundary, it's where growth happens. It's where the real conversations begin. So lean in, be inspired, and let's explore what lies beyond the edge.
And joining us today is the wonderful Dimi Lattas. Dimi, how are you?
Dimitra, or Dimi Lattas, is a social work lecturer at the University of the Sunshine Coast, passionate about advancing forensic social work education in Australia. Dimi's research specializes in forensic social work and developing innovative educational practices that reflect industry expectations. In 2024, Dimi won the National Organization of Forensic Social Work's Albert Roberts Scholarship and the AASW National Social Work Researcher of the Year. She has been selected for the 2025 to 2026 Fulbright Scholarship. Her research has been recognized internationally, with invitations to present in Australia, the UK, the US, Taiwan, and Italy. Dimi is currently drafting the Australian Forensic Mental Health Social Work National Competency Framework.
Yeah, good, thank you. How are you?
Fantastic. That was a wonderful little experience we had in the background. Now we won't go with that, but it was awesome. And whereabouts are you based, Dimi?
So I'm in Brisbane. I'm with the University of the Sunshine Coast in our Moreton Bay campus.
Oh, excellent, excellent. And what's the weather like up there today?
I mean, Queensland is always lovely and sunny.
Oh, come on, I spent 30 years in Queensland. Have we still got the 4:30 p.m. thunderstorms and that roll in?
You know, I've been lucky. I only recently moved down from Hervey Bay, which was always 30 and sunny, and now it's actually been quite nice in Brisbane. I haven't had a wet summer yet.
Oh, jeez. It's coming. It's coming. Unless, of course, we have this thing called climate change, in which case it's not coming. So, all right, Dimi, I'll put you on. So, because you do it fascinating. Oh, and you've won Social Work Researcher of the Year. You're a Fulbright Scholar recipient. And your field of interest is forensic social work. For those who are like me, what does that do?
So forensic social work is social workers who work in the criminal justice or criminal legal system. So that can include your kind of forensic mental health services, people who have severe or chronic mental health issues alongside their offending behaviours. And then it can be correctional social work, working in, youth detentions, adult detention, probation, parole, and youth justice work all across that spectrum.
Okay. And is there anything particular in that field that you specialise?
So my particular area of practice is how do we prepare our graduates, our social work graduates, to go into correctional spaces. So if you can imagine, the social work degree is quite broad. Social workers, and it's one of the benefits, it's why a lot of people study social work, is that you can work across the entire human service sector. That's great, but it makes you a jack of all trades rather than having any one distinct specialist knowledge. My research argues that potentially one of the missteps that Australia is making is that there are some areas of practice, like forensics, which require a bit of extra training and a bit of extra skill development. If we think about our, maladaptive or violent behaviors, they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in quite complex social and political dynamics. So we need to understand how to address that as practitioners. And if you haven't been taught that, how do you know how to address that?
Oh. They're interesting environments, correctional facilities, aren't they?
Yeah.
Uh,
And they're not particularly friendly to social workers. So Australia has, a very long history of incarcerating people. So if you look at when was the first prison built in Australia, it's literally on the day after they, colonized Australia. And we very, very quickly have a short succession where we start building courts and prisons immediately. And social workers go into courts and prisons quite quickly in Australia, but there's a kind of caveat there that we have this relationship that's working symbiotically, and then there's a change around the 80s. So in the 50s particularly, all social workers working in probation and parole, really, important to the development of social work as a profession in Australia, really, great relationship. However, we get some changes around the 80s where there's changes to the pay, changes to what degree is required to work in those roles. And we start to see social workers abandon those roles. And now in most of our facilities, if you think about youth justice, child protection, correctional, they're not social work specific roles. And there's less and less social workers working in them, and they're more interdisciplinary, drawing from a whole wide range of human service professions. And that has definitely changed the dynamics. And if you compare that to something like forensic mental health, which took its kind of origins, not from corrections, but from psychiatric social work, it's held its kind of social work identity. And there's a lot more social workers per, actual roles in those health roles because they consider themselves a health-based role rather than a justice role. And so there's been a real shift in Australia around that relationship, which changes the flavor. It changes the relationship. So social workers don't enjoy working in correctional. There's a lot of research. They don't enjoy these spaces because they don't feel like there's enough professional freedom. They don't feel like they can enact meaningful change, and they kind of butt heads against the system and they leave those roles. And the problem is that them leaving the roles doesn't fix the problems. We still have just as many young people offending. We still have just as many people incarcerated. So just because the social workers aren't working, that doesn't mean the problem's fixed.
Yeah, you mentioned, you said it was particularly lacking in Australia. Is there any countries that, in your opinion, do or manage this a bit better?
So forensic social work is a bit of an interesting one to look at. America has a specialist model, so they don't allow their students to go from a bachelor's level into any sort of clinical roles. You have to then specialize. And that specialization, allows them to develop those advanced skills. So a lot of forensic social workers working in mitigation and public defense in the US. In, say, Britain, they do like more of an internship. So if you graduate, you have kind of 2-year traineeship that you do while you develop that additional knowledge. So a lot of people are doing this kind of specialist training. There's a lack of kind of research internationally on what benefits that offers, and whether or not, each model is better than the others. And hopefully that's where some of my future research is going to come into it.
Fantastic. Any opinions why we ended up in Australia without providing that extra support for people graduating?
So there's a few reasons. Australia is a small population. So when it was developing or first professionalizing social work, there was a kind of split between American and US based scholars who came over to teach social work. And we see Australian social work education follow and kind of be torn, particularly in the 80s around that. So University of Sydney had a specialization, but ultimately, around the end of Whitlam, there was kind of no, get rid of specialization. We need one professional collective voice to be recognized in universities. And so they just kept the generalist social work. And it was the one that kind of ran with and was used to kind of, promote social work around Australia. So it kind of has that. It was necessary. Not that it's like a negative thing, but it's just left us in a position where I think there's a potential gap between what we're teaching and what we're expecting people to do in practice.
How do you go about preparing graduates for, well, you talked about a couple of things, corrections, but also you talked about child protection, which to me are the highly traumatic environments, potential conflict at any stage. And you've got people who may literally walk in and be unaware of the situation.
Yeah.
And I would suspect that particularly anyone dealing in these situations, that the chances of picking up vicarious trauma or just post-traumatic stress from the job is huge.
Yeah, it is huge. And you're correct. So child protection and forensic social work share a lot of those similar risks. And there's a lot of research out there that says that we don't prepare social workers for, child protection enough. In previous years, child protection used to do a lot of that themselves, like do a huge amount of training for somebody when they became on as a caseworker. Over time, changes to policy and changes to funding kind of reduce those things over time. But what you bring up is a really good point, that if we take one example, which is managing a heightened client or managing a potentially violent situation, that's very common in both child protection and all forensic social work roles. And it's not mandated. Currently in Australia, there's no mandated component of social work education that you have to teach students how to de-escalate a client. So we can't guarantee that social work students have that capability, yet we know it's a competency. And we know, and it's worse in America, but in Australia, still workplace violence is a huge issue. And that can be, on the spectrum from intimidating a social worker or being verbally abusive to a social worker, all the way down to, homicide and assaults. But we know that this is a problem, and we haven't yet learnt to deal with it as a profession or in an educational way. And it's not an easy thing to do, because de-escalation is obviously a very tricky skill to me. If me and you both go to a home visit individually, the response I get might be different to the response you get. There's a level of positionality there. There's a level of luck that when you're there, it might be particular certain conflicts. We know there are, categorical and evidence-based risks, substance misuse previously or currently at the time of the violence, your role, what you're there to do. But there's a lot of jokes that, and black humor that goes on in social work. The police often turn up to a home visit with their guns, and social workers turn up with their badges. And that's not necessarily appropriate. And experiences of workplace violence and workplace aggression decrease social workers' occupational commitment. They increase our feelings of wanting to leave. And so we burn through a lot more social workers if we don't have appropriate responses to violence, and we don't have appropriate ways to prevent and manage violence when they occur.
Could some of the work where you're helping prepare people, not just social workers, but other members that have to deal within these institutionalized situations, shall we say, could that be influencing or helping prepare things like psychologists who just graduated all the way up to magistrates in the court system to understand the dynamics of what's actually going on with, I don't want to say an offender,
Person who's using
at-risk person.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yes. And we did a very small study that's not yet published of applying a very similar process to police interactions with young people, because most commonly the police are the people interacting with, our complex and our vulnerable young people. And those dynamics are important. So yes, you can use the same sort of de-escalation training, and police do de-escalation training. I'm not saying they don't, they definitely do. But from a trauma-informed perspective, from a youth developmentally focused perspective, can help. And they've done some research, particularly in Ireland, around making their correctional staff, not their social work staff or their practitioner staff, but their correctional staff more aware of power dynamics and power consciousness, to understand triggers and to reduce the violence. And if we think about our incarcerated population anywhere in the world, but here in Australia, it's a very high percentage of those people have experienced chronic, substantial trauma in their life. And that's like that chronic stress response that we see. And so the risk of violence to that profession is extremely high. If you're confining a population that has already experienced violence, is normalized with violence, has survival mechanisms of violence, the risk of violence is obviously extremely high. So if we can develop training that makes people aware of those responses and have a better relationship and, a way to manage those responses, you'll have better outcomes. You'll have less violence. You'll have less violent incidents. You'll have better workforce.
Yeah. Yeah. I often tell people who aren't aware, because I'd say 95% of the population aren't aware, that the correctional staff I've met are true heroes of our society, because the things that they endure on a daily basis would not be tolerated in any other workplace, I believe. And I will be honest and say they don't generally tend to earn the mega salaries that some other people do.
Mhm.
And they turn up and they keep society safe. And it's brutally honest. They keep society safe and, at least in theory, can help rehabilitate people who lost their way along life's path, perhaps.
Mhm.
At least potentially. Some of the things I've seen is, when I've talked to correctional officers, it's constantly things that you can be spat on at any moment. You can be assaulted.
Yeah.
You have to witness some pretty horrific violence, person to person, and even self-inflicted in pretty traumatic ways.
Yeah.
Verbal abuse literally every moment of the day. These are huge things that the staff actually have to work with and perhaps, I don't know, silo before they go home at the end of each day. So it is definitely an interesting environment. Speaking of home visits, believe it or not, one stage I used to go and do home visits in the community. And we went with two people because it was deemed our clientele, that shall we say. We weren't even have badges. We didn't have any of that, anything to restrain or anything like that. We had the power of our voice. And to put this in perspective, the first thing I ever did when I went to anyone's residence was first of all, find point where the exits are, and it sounds weird, but work out where the door opens, which way the door opens when someone enters the door, because you don't want to be standing behind a door when it gets slammed open or slammed shut. It's stuff which most people just even think about when they're heading into a situation. Tell me, you've done a fair bit of work, and you talked about these types of events that lead to people maybe being incarcerated. They don't actually operate in a bubble. It's just whole lot of society pressures, cultural pressures, etc., trauma that may be revisited upon people. Are the courts and the laws that are put in place adequate to take those sort of factors into account? Or do they just look at the snapshot of what's considered to be the offence?
It's a complicated situation. I don't think it's just the law, it's just one thing. But so we know, if we take the example of young people who are justice involved, and we look at the proportion of those young people who are in out-of-home care, so people who have been removed from their family homes because it's deemed to be unsafe, you'll see that it's well and truly over half. So, and there's a level of problem with that, when it comes to, getting people out of custody. If you don't have placements, if you need to go into a certain level of risk placement and stuff like that. So you start criminalizing their experiences. And this is a problem that these young people face. It's not one factor. And the reason why no one is solving it, the reason why is people want to put forward really simplistic options of what will solve youth crime. If we lock everybody up, it'll be better. But we know fundamentally that that's not true. A lot of this kind of reactive behavior in kind of the 11 to 13s is stuff that happened when the kid was, very, very young, for years and years and years, chronic stress, chronic exposure to adverse childhood experiences. So it's definitely not a one way to fix it, but we know that the way of kind of increasing, incarceration, that doesn't have the same effect, almost huge amounts of research. I won't say all, but like huge amounts of research has proven that if you put a young person in prison for longer, that is not going to deter them when they get out from future offending behaviors. You have to actually work with programs that are evidence-based to reduce the factors that are likely to contribute to that person reoffending.
Could I just get you to say that one more time in simpler terms? Does locking up young offenders for long periods of times actually work?
No. You embed their criminal identities a lot more. You take them out of an environment. So you start developing an identity that has very little to do with anything besides offending. You ingratiate them in social circles where they kind of embed themselves in, and you increase their risk of offending. So almost all research shows us that as soon as you even start using the term offender, the whole process of putting someone through custody, you start to shape that young person's identity. And we all know, we've known for years that adolescence is a time for identity shifts, right? It's why you see young people dress as goths and, go through different music phases. They're often trying to decide who they are. So if you take this pivotal key time in somebody's life and force them into an identity that's negative, the outcome will be negative as well.
Well, it's my experience, and from what I've been told by a few people who may work in, we're going to use the term loosely, industry, is a lot of youth detention centres eventually become universities for future criminals. It's where you get offenders who are in on a minor charge and you mix them with offenders who have done pretty shocking things, and they learn from their peers. And then they go back in the community and they've had years of being basically, this is normal behaviour. And so they repeat the normal behaviour that they've learned within a detention facility. Okay, if we've got all this research that says this just clearly does not work, at least in your opinion, why are we doing it?
I think we do it for a few reasons. One reason is it makes the public feel safer. So the perception then is that there's a level of safety. It seems quicker and easier than the long-term fixes that I'm talking about. A lot of what I'm talking about and what everybody's talking about is quite significant, therapeutic work, and that takes time. And there is this balance, right? We do have to balance community safety. So we know that young people who experience adverse childhood experiences, particularly prolonged or chronic adverse childhood experiences, engage in risky behaviors. Prime example, stealing a car. If you imagine the process of stealing a car, it allows your hyper nervous system to have the kind of regulation that it wants, and it allows them to have the experience that makes them feel a little bit more sated in that moment. So people go through these, really important moments in their lives, and then they do something that's maladaptive. We know it's maladaptive, and then they get criminalized for it. They also have very little stability. So when you go into a place like prisons that have, routines and everything like that, it creates a form of stability for them as well. So there are these kind of factors that we're forcing people into. And I think if the public could read the backstory and could understand the experience of that young person, I think their response would be different. I'm not advocating that youth crime doesn't, cause harm. It definitely causes harm. It's just that we need to work out a better way of managing and it is a small population. So, when you look at, and there's a lot of misconceptions, right? That there's more naughty kids out there. That's actually not technically true. So youth crime in general has dropped, but the kind of chronic young, offender category that we call them in Queensland, which is not a very nice term, but that population has grown, and that population is more likely to engage in violent behaviors or, worse kind of criminal activities, more, quicker succession, and what we would consider maybe higher on that scale. So that population hasn't decreased. So that tells us that what we're doing works with usually our less traumatized clients and our less at-risk clients. But what we're doing is not currently working for our most complicated and most complex client group.
Effectively, are we writing off that segment of the youth population right at the word go?
And it's hard, isn't it? I think that we're not even thinking about that. I think that we're often thinking about the next 4 years.
Speaking of which, does it worry you that we seem to be very susceptible for glib 4 or 5 word slogans, particularly in relation to getting tough on crime, getting tough on kids. You know, some of the rubbish I've heard. You do the adult crime, you do the adult time, which is really glib and falls off the mouth pretty easy, but it fails to take into account the long-term effects, both on the individual and probably the community. Does that frustrate you?
Does. But I think it frustrates everybody when social problems are reduced to a political kind of interest. I think ultimately it depends on whether those policies are put in affect our practice. You know, I'm very pro some of the things that were kind of said that they were going to do, like recognizing that increased child protection workers would have an impact on crime, though I think that still those child protection workers would need to be trained in how to recognize and address these behaviors before they become, into our adult, our youth crime population. So that stuff is there, but some of the training is still not there. So we can increase the numbers. Great to have that recognition that we see crossover children. And I think we've got to get some of the literature out there a little bit more as a counter narrative. So if the population was aware of some of this stuff and, of crossover children, I think that they would have a very different response to their relationships and perceptions of youth.
Yeah. I'm all for getting more child protection workers. I just don't know how you do that, where they're going to spring from, because it's not a matter of just actually, grabbing more people and throwing them in there. You've got to retain them. And that seems to be a huge issue in child protection. Huge issue. I remember many, many years ago, you needed a qualification in psychology or something similar. And it seems we've lowered the bar because we're just not getting and retaining the people, which is, I don't know, failure of the system itself, I guess.
Yeah. And that was part of, so when I was talking about that history of social work in corrections, that's part of it, isn't it? We know we're churning through our social workers and we're not able to retain them. These are workforce issues. So we need to change the landscape to make social workers stay in these programs. And whether that is changing the program, whether that's changing the social workers' capacity in the program, a little bit of both.
Yeah. So, as I said, every time we have an election, at least recently, it's tougher sentencing. It's more mandatory sentences. And the last few elections I've seen around Australia and states, there's been an emphasis on, sending younger and younger children to jail, or at least making them eligible to go to jail for certain offences. So as a result of the last election in Queensland, we basically have things that, we've now got the amendments to the Youth Justice Act, where we've got children who commit specified offences are liable to the same maximum mandatory penalties as adults. Well, that's awesome, but they're children.
Yeah. And they're not just children. They're children who likely have significant developmental trauma. And so we kind of try to think of them as an atypical, 13-year-old or 10-year-old, 11-year-old, when they aren't. They are usually quite substantially behind their peers because of their adversities.
Yeah. It goes so far. I mean, I was looking at the Northern Territories laws. The Northern Territories laws, where they're looking at potentially jailing 10-year-olds for adult-related crimes.
Yeah.
Now, and being a father of grown-up children, I can tell you my 10-year-old's made some pretty dumb decisions. I'm pretty sure as a 10-year-old, I made some pretty dumb decisions. And don't think it would have benefited me to be separated from a family and thrown into a correctional facility at 10 years old.
Yeah. And then to imagine the trauma that's associated with that. And we're not the only country. There are states in the US that can incarcerate an infant, but and up to, like there are lots of states that can incarcerate from 6 years on. And, again, we look at a 6-year-old and their capacity to take responsibility for their actions is very limited. I think that there's an important discussion in Australia going on. And I do like the counter narrative. The raise the age of criminal responsibility is also getting, quite a substantial support. We're actually getting, I think, more divided on the issue in Australia. There's substantial support for raise the age of criminal responsibility. And then there's a high proportion of people unhappy with the way in which we're dealing with youth crime. So it's kind of a dual thing. And one of the problems is because we have that split, we're kind of trying to appease both and not doing either. So we still incarcerate people that are too young, and then everybody thinks we're being too lenient. So it's kind of this dual system of we need to actually have a kind of consistent response that aligns with, good research about how to create meaningful change within these young people.
Excellent. Dimi, we might leave it there today. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you and actually learning something from this, because I certainly do not know how to influence anything in our system, from our counsellors, psychologists, court staff, right up to magistrates. And I'll be honest with you, I think you've got a job cut out for you to actually influence the public conversation about this, because I think for the last probably 20 years, all I've seen is tougher, harder, longer sentences, regardless of the age. But I do appreciate the work you're doing, because anything that helps protect both people who are within the system or people who work within the system is well and truly worthwhile, and it's something which hasn't been paid enough attention to by anyone in political circles. So thank you very much for your work, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Voices from the Edge. If you like what we are doing, like the episode and the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss any future episodes, and leave a positive review.